On the face of it, White's victory in the coming game looks relatively straightforward. But it's only when we begin to try to play chess in this manner that we realise that it is anything but straightforward to win an almost perfect game. I'm Andrew Martin, and welcome to my BCM Game of the Month for December 2012. And it's the excellent game from Hoogeveen between Hikaru Nakamura playing white and Sergei Tiviakov playing black. So both world-class grandmasters. Nakamura played e4, possibly expecting the Scandinavian, but Tiviakov deviated with his new creation, the French defence. And possibly sensing an opening surprise, Nakamura ducked the main lines with d4, going back into a King's Indian attack-like structure with d3. Perhaps the only difference between this variation and the King's Indian attack proper is that white has not yet developed his knight to d2. He doesn't need to just yet because black isn't really applying any pressure to the e4 pawn. Because white hasn't played knight d2, there are possibly more aggressive plans available to him based upon the moves c3 and then d4. So for instance, white might play bishop g2, castles, rook e1 and then c3 before getting that knight on b1 out. This gives the opening a more aggressive flavour than the normal King's Indian attack structure where the knight's on d2. Well, black could of course play d5 now, and I've no doubt after that Nakamura would have played knight to d2. But instead, Tiviakov played g6, inviting white to play the opening in a slightly sharper manner than usual, and it's a challenge which Nakamura takes up with the unusual move d4, taking the game in an altogether different direction to the one we're used to with the King's Indian attack. White is trying to take direct advantage of the weak dark squares, perhaps temporarily weak, in the black camp. While in typical Sicilian style, black took, white recaptured, and now black faces a difficult choice early on. Well, as I say, this square d6 looks rather weak, so I presume that if black were to play bishop g7 now, white was considering knight d5. This may well be playable for black though, after d5. It looks like a mistake, and white can certainly grab a pawn here, basing his pawn grab on queen takes d5, knight c7 check. But I think black can play better than that with queen e7 check. And after bishop e2, I'm convinced now that the strongest move for black is bishop h3. There was an annotation on the ChessBase website by Sap Farley where he mentioned bishop e5 in this position and bishop e6. But I think bishop h3 is pretty strong. And, well, black certainly has compensation. For instance, if white plays queen d6 here, then black can even play rook d8. White plays knight c7 check. The problem with this white play is that he's only moving two pieces. He's slipping a long way behind in development. So black has excellent activity here, and for instance bishop g2 and then knight d4 continues the aggression. I think black may be better in this position. Well, that's by no means a forced variation. Now in the game Royset versus Mises, Norway 2012, and bear in mind the black player is 2-4-9-8, black played the immediate d5. But after that, I think bishop b5 is the way to go for white. After d takes e4, knight takes c6, black has to play this forcing variation. He takes on d1, he hits the bishop drops back, and now bishop d7. This is the only route to get to even a halfway playable position for black. But after knight c3, white definitely has the advantage. He's going to regain this e4 pawn, and black's pawn structure will be very compromised, let's put it that way. So going back to the game itself, Tiviakov had plenty to think about. Perhaps next time, if he gets to this position, he'll choose bishop g7 and just allow knight b5. It seems as though he's able to do that. But he played the understandable move here, a6, just keeping the knight out of b5. Of course, this does allow white to get a kind of Roxy bind structure, and that's exactly what Nakamura went for with knight takes c6 and then pawn up to c4. Right, now in the game Becker versus Grigorov, Albania 2011, White played the tempting move, queen to d4. After queen f6, the queens came off, and now I think white missed his chance for an advantage in this position. It's possible this position may be good for white. Becker played bishop to g2, but I don't think that's best. I think white's got to jab immediately with e5. And as far as I can see, there's no continuation for black, which gives full equality. For instance, if he plays knight to d5, c4, knight to b4, and an extraordinary move suggested by Deep Fritz 13, king to d2. Funny looking move, but black's plan is simply now, white's plan is simply a3, nabbing the knight. So black's got to be very careful here. If he plays a5, we go knight c3, and if he goes bishop g7, we can build up quite nicely with f4, hit the knight, drive it back to a6, take on f6, and now king to c2, with a preferable game for white. It seems much easier to me for white to be able to coordinate his pieces. So running that one more time, queen d4, queen f6, off come the queens, e5, and now how about knight g4? Well, white has another surprising idea up his sleeve here. He can play bishop e2. And now if black takes on e5, he loses the knight to f4. So black's probably got to play f5. And again, after f4, bishop c5, knight c3, white has the more comfortable game. Even though black can play either knight f2 or bishop f2 check. Neither of these moves are convincing, and it just seems easier for white to get his pieces out. So once again, there was an alternative for Nakamura in this case, but he sticks with c4. So now we get a kind of traditional Maroczy bind where black has to cope with a potential weak d pawn. And in fact, this problem plagues Tiviakov throughout the game. Just dropping back, perhaps f5 is a possibility. After that, we could see the continuation knight to c3, f takes e4, knight takes e4, and then pawn up to d5. This was certainly a more active continuation than the game itself. Perhaps Tiviakov in this game errs on the side of caution a little too much. And this allows Nakamura to build up a nice initiative here with bishop g5. Somehow, black has to break the cramping influence of these two pawns on c4 and e4. The whole idea of Maroczy bind positions is that black is cramped. Those two pawns stop him from breaking free and thus releasing the energy of his pieces. So black is looking definitely to play either d5 or f5 somewhere along the line to break the cramp. Well, Nakamura seems to be able to stop Tiviakov in this game quite comfortably. So both sides continue building up. The only difference between the two players is that black's setup looks very, very passive, whereas white is just developing his pieces easily and nicely to good squares. If there is an Achilles heel in white's position, it has to be the d4 square. So black's next move makes a lot of sense. If he can, he wants to be able to sink a knight or a bishop into d4. The problem is, of course, that knight on e7 is pinned. So Nakamura continues building up patiently with b3, and black plays bishop b7. Now white's got a nice position, and it's a question of what he does with it. This is the dilemma that faces club players week in, week out in their own games. You get a good position out of the opening. What do you do next? It's this next phase of the game which really separates the men from the boys. This is where the grandmasters really shine through. They have a really good idea of where they're going out of the opening, and they have middle game plans prepared. So Nakamura plays h4, hoping to weaken the black king side by playing h5 and create dark squares pressure, possibly with the help of h6 a little bit further down the line. Black plays h5, white goes queen to d3, black plays bishop to c6, and Nakamura continues unhurriedly manoeuvring, whereas Tiviakov battens down the hatches on the king side for some sort of difficult defence. Now comes a very strong idea from Nakamura, rook to d3. And with this move, he announces that he's going to put all three of his major pieces on the d file to hit at that pawn on d6. And the problem is that Tiviakov never really finds a satisfactory defence to this plan. In fact, he immediately goes wrong now with one natural move too many, rook dc8. I mean, we know why he wants to do this. He wants to put his knight on d4. But he had to play in this position, rook to d7. For one extra move, he had to keep the protection of d6. And the point of this is that if white now plays rook cd1, black is on time to come to d4. He plays knight c6, and if queen to d2, there's even knight b4 in this position, as white can't take on d6 because the c3 knight hangs at the end. So we get rook e3, knight c6. Well, this is a much better chance for black than the game. I think, basically, going back to the game, with rook dc8, Tiviakov misses his last chance to get a decent position. He might be slightly worse after, for instance, rook d7, but not much more than that. Now it's fairly plain sailing, as Nakamura bombards d6. This is a very difficult position for black. It's clear that black didn't like bishop d4 here, possibly because of the straightforward move knight e2. And whilst it's difficult to absolutely call this position, you can't help but feel that the black squares around the king there, the black king, will really make all the difference. So going back to the game, black played bishop e5, white played rook to d1, king h7, and now just an insidious move, king h1. A rather sadistic move in many ways, basically saying, well, what is your next move? What are you going to do? Tiviakov knows that he can't do very much, so he hopes just to manoeuvre and not to weaken his position any further. But after bishop e3, bishop g7, knight e2, rook d8, and now bishop f4, black is obliged to weaken his position. As he can't play bishop e5 now, the pawn on d6 is pinned. So he's got to play e5, white probes, black plays f6, and now white just drops back, content to have induced two weakening moves, e5 and f6. And basically, without having fired a single shot in anger in this game, Tiviakov finds himself in a horrible passive position. He tries vainly to bring the knight around to d4, but white's right on time with knight c3. Now the knight can't even leave e7 because the white knight hops into d5. So black continues playing passively. White continues his unhurried build-up, and now comes the excellent pawn lever f4. This is opening up a second front, creating a second weakness, if you like. Classical chess. One weakness, well, maybe the guy can defend. Two weaknesses, in this case, an open king. There's no chance for black. And that's exactly what happened. Tiviakov continued doing nothing. White opened the king side, put the knight on e7 in a pin, black unpinned, bishop h3, hitting the rook, and then rook f1. Infiltration on the king side seems inevitable. Black offered the exchange of pieces. White declined. Black brought his bishop into what he thought was a better square, but unfortunately this drops the d6 pawn. And after takes, black decided to resign. His weakness on d6 has been erased, and he now faces a systematic demolition of the rest of his position. So a deceptively simple game by Nakamura, where he didn't seem to do very much, but everything that he did was right. This is the essence of true mastery.